Lord, maker of heaven and earth. You heard that right? That's what David said in the Psalms. We are called to live in the present with our focus being on the hope for the future as we share this gift of life together. As followers of Jesus, we live in anticipation and hope as we keep our sights on God and on the second return of Jesus. And why is that important? Because it is at that time that we will live and love in a perfect world together, the New Jerusalem. But in the meantime, we live through seasons of both joy and sorrow. Each year is a unique combination of events that will never occur again. And we can choose to embrace what comes our way or try to run and hide from it. The Bible tells us of the importance of looking in the past, and it's in the looking of the past that we remember our heritage and the saints that have gone before us. We learn from them and from each other as we walk along our own journey of life. And we know we are not to dwell in the past or to worry about the future. It's been said that worry brings tomorrow's troubles into today. Well, we don't want that, right? We will miss too much of today's life if we spend too much time in the past or too much time worrying about the future. And only God knows about that anyway. But as we find this year coming to an end, it is good to take time to do a time of reflection and a healthy look back. Many things have transpired this past year for us individually and as a church. Some worth remembering, other issues needing to be dealt with and resolved. And unlike God, who is freed from the confines of time, we live in a world with a calendar. But that time and that calendar is also a gift from God. For as simply as one year ends, a new one begins. It can either bring life and hope or a continuance of despair. The choice is ours. We can work with God to build a future of love and grace or simply survive each day as it comes. Hope leads us on in anticipation of what God will do. Can you look back at 2019 and praise God for this year? Were there joys and sorrows that were instrumental in making you who you are today? Perhaps the challenges strengthened your faith or helped you to grow stronger. Or maybe they weakened you and humbly brought you to your knees as you recognized your need for God. Matthew 25 is a popular passage that helps us to review how we are doing in our faith journey. In speaking about the judgment of the nations, Jesus told of separating the sheep from the goats. And he will ask us some very important questions on how we lived our lives. It's a very comprehensive list, and we should pay attention to it. And so I ask you, in 2019, how did your life measure up to Matthew 25? Let's ponder the 6 categories upon which we will be judged. Number 1, did we feed the hungry? Number 2, did we offer water to the thirsty? Number 3, did we welcome the stranger? Number 4, did we clothe the naked? Number 5, did we care for the sick? And number 6, did we visit the imprisoned? These things are important because they are concrete ways the people of God are called to love and see to the needs of each other. These acts put our faith into action. So how did you do? How did we do as a church? Every day we wake up, there is work for us to do. Every person in every way has a responsibility to fit into the community of the world. None are exempt. All are needed. Each person a child of God. How many times are we surprised at how life fits together among us? There was a story printed in the Reader's Digest in 1954, and and it was called The Gold and the Ivory Tablecloth. It was written by Howard Schneidy. We love stories, don't we? And when we gather together, we share stories of today and we share stories of days gone by. Many of us have our own miracle stories to share. And that's where this story comes in. So this is the story of the gold and ivory tablecloth. It just so happened there was a pastor who was very young serving at a church, but his church was very old. And once long ago it had flourished. Famous men had preached from its pulpit and stood and prayed before its altar. Rich and poor alike had worshiped there. Now the good days had passed from this section of town where it stood, but the pastor and his young wife believed in their rundown church. They felt that with paint, hammer, and a good strong faith, they could get it into shape. And together they went to work for a much-needed facelift. But late in December, a severe storm whipped through the valley and the worst blow fell upon the church. A huge chunk of rain-soaked plaster fell from the inside wall just behind the altar. Sorrowfully, the pastor and his wife swept away the mess. But they couldn't hide the ragged hole that was left behind. The pastor looked at it and had to remind himself quickly to say, "Thy will be done." But his wife wept. "Christmas is only 2 days away," she said, "and we've worked so hard." That afternoon, the dispirited couple attended an auction held for the benefit of the youth group. The auctioneer opened a box and shook out a handsome gold and ivory lace tablecloth. It was a magnificent item, nearly 15 feet long, but it too was outdated from a long ago vanished era. Who today had any use for such a thing? There were a few half-hearted bids, but then the pastor was seized with a great idea. He bid $6.50 for it. And he carried that cloth back to the church and tacked it up on the wall behind the altar. It completely hid the hole, and the extraordinary beauty of the shimmering handiwork cast a fine holiday glow over the chancel. In his renewed joy, he felt like it was a great triumph. Happily, he went back to preparing for Christmas service. Just before noon on the day of Christmas Eve, as the pastor was opening the church, he noticed a woman standing in the cold at the bus stop. "The bus won't be here for 40 minutes, he shouted, and he invited her into the church to get warm. She told him that she had come from the city that morning to be interviewed for a job as a governess to the children of a wealthy family in town, but she had been turned down because her English was imperfect. The woman sat down in a pew, rubbed her hands to get them warm, and simply rested. After a while, she dropped her head and prayed. Then she looked up, and as the pastor began to adjust the great gold and ivory cloth across the hole, she rose suddenly and walked up the steps to the chancel. She looked at the tablecloth. The pastor smiled and started to tell her about the storm damage, but it seemed like she wasn't listening. She took up a fold of the cloth and rubbed it between her fingers. "It is mine," she said. "It's my banquet cloth." And she lifted up a corner and she showed the surprised pastor that there were initials monogrammed on it. "My husband had this cloth made especially for me in Brussels. There couldn't be another one like it." And for the next few minutes, the woman and the pastor talked excitedly together. She explained that she was Viennese and that she and her husband had opposed the Nazis and decided to leave their home country. They were advised to go separately. Her husband put her on a train to Switzerland, and they planned that he would join her as soon as he could arrange to ship their household goods across the border. She never saw him again. Later, she heard that he had died in a concentration camp. "I have always felt like it was my fault to leave without him," she said. "Perhaps these years of wandering have been my punishment." Pastor tried to comfort her and urged her to take but she refused and went on her way. As the church began to fill on Christmas Eve, it was clear that the cloth was going to be a great success. It had been skillfully designed to look its best at candlelight. And after the service, the pastor stood at the doorway, and many people told him that the church looked so beautiful. And one gentle-faced, middle-aged man who was the local clock and watch repairman in town approached him, looking rather puzzled. "It is strange," he said in a soft accent. "Many years ago, my wife, God rest her, had owned such a cloth in our home in Vienna. My wife put it on the table, but only once when the bishop came to dinner." The pastor suddenly became very excited. He told the jeweler about the woman who had been in the church earlier that day. And the startled jeweler clutched the pastor's arm and said, "Can it be? Does she live?" Together, they got in touch with the family who had interviewed her. And then, in the pastor's car, they started in for the city. And as Christmas Day was born, this man and his wife, who had been separated for so many sad and Yuletide Christmases, were reunited. Now, some might say this was a coincidence, but those of us that have faith would most likely think that it was some divine intervention. Rather than coincidence, we might call it a God incidence. The driving rainstorm that damaged the church, the cold that drove the woman to wait in the church for the bus, the man attending that particular service on Christmas Eve, well, for this couple, for the pastor, and for that congregation, it appears that it was the best rainstorm ever. The memory of that rainstorm and the physical damage to the church pales in comparison to the love that was found in the story of the reuniting of these two people. This story becoming a story of hope for that church. As you reflect this weekend, with the calendar year coming to a close, I want you to look back at this year and see if there were any instances where you were in the right place at the right time, where God used you in a powerful way, or even in a tiny little insignificant way. And then I want you to consider how this encounter made a difference in your life or in the life of another. When we can see God's hand at work, it reminds us that Emmanuel is with us and that God cares about us and our everyday lives. That's the level of love that is so hard for us to comprehend. And that's also the love that sent Jesus to live among us. I hope you enjoyed this story and that it will lift your spirits in anticipation for what God can and will do in the year ahead. We know that nothing is impossible for God. We know that there is work to do in God's world. And we know that together we are the body of Christ in the world. You never know when your interaction with someone is participation with God in God's plan in the world. And as we finish out 2019 and look with anticipation towards 2020 and what it will bring, I offer you this statement as a mantra for the coming year. Without Jesus, this life is as good as it gets. But with Jesus, the best is yet to come. Thanks be to God. Amen.